For those of you on the call who are students, you should know that AjiFanta is the graduate assistant for the Government and Politics Department. So if you need anything or want to hear about the BA/MA program, she's also a good person to talk to. So in introducing her, AjiFanta Marenah was born in the Gambia and migrated to the US when she was 12 years old. She is currently completing her master's at St. John's University, where she concentrates in international relations and conflict resolution. Currently, she works as a graduate assistant with the government department at St. John's, as well as a research assistant with the Rose Lockesim Foundation, where she assists a coalition of organizations with consultations for victims of human rights violations and compiling evidence for the prosecution of the former dictator of the Gambia. In the past, she has held various internship positions, including at Human Rights Watch and the Bronx Civil Court. AjiFanta is invested in working to assist victims of mass atrocities in gaining justice from authoritarian regimes and raising awareness on the impact that gender disparities have on the welfare of women during the transitional justice and migration periods. So we're so happy to have you guest lecturing today for Government 1010, which is contemporary government. And the students are getting a survey of what are government and politics, what are their purposes, how can you engage with it? And this focus obviously is on gender and migration. So we're excited to hear what you have to say and just get to know you more as well.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Karen. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who's online here today. Thank you for your time. Without any more wasting of your time, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. So my lecture today would focus on sub-Saharan African migration and a little bit on gender issues during migration as well. So I'm gonna share my screen, Karen, if that's okay.
That's perfect. Is it letting you?
It said host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I think you have to give me permission.
I'm gonna make you a co-host really quickly. Okay, it should work now.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I'll be focusing on sub-Saharan African migration and its intersection with gender studies. So first, it's important to note that despite the current discussions on migration, migration is not a new phenomenon. It has been going on for over 60,000 years when the Africans first started peopling the earth, so like migrating north. So it is also a multifaceted phenomenon, which means that migration is very complex. It's not just one kind of migration. There's economic migration, people who migrate for educational purposes, refugees who flee from conflicts, people who migrate as tourists, and there's also a group of people who migrate due to environmental crisis. Currently, they're not recognized as refugees by the United Nations, which is a topic worth exploring if any of you are interested in that. African migration specifically as well, despite like current talks about migration of Africans to the United States or Europe and the policies restricting them, is not all geared towards Europe. Majority of Africans migrate within the continent itself and regionally in those areas. So most Africans most Africans first start migrating from the urban areas, so from the villages and stuff, into the rural areas for economic reasons as well, and connecting with families before they even travel regionally or further within the continent. And as we will explore more on here, majority of the African migrants are males, and we'll talk about like the complications of that. And also feel free to like stop me at any moment if you have questions or comments. I want this to be as interactive as possible, not just me lecturing at you. So why do Africans migrate? There's numerous reasons why Africans migrate. Would anyone like to give me some explanations for why they think Africans migrate? If not, we will just go. Okay, looks like Karen's saying something.
Yeah, just to say, students, if anyone wants to say something, that'll be helpful. But I was going to ask either now or later, AjiFanta, what are some myths you think there are about why people migrate, that like misunderstandings?
Yeah, so I'll definitely answer that as we go in, but to just briefly go in, a lot of the myths of why people, especially Africans, migrate is more on economic migration. A lot of people just look at migration as economic migration and kind of disregard the many other reasons of why people migrate, such as like running from conflicts, famines, droughts, connecting with families. Some get jobs here, especially within the US. Some get hired and come here. Some travel for educational purposes. And like I said, reconnecting with family members. So all of those other reasons are mostly like hidden and not talked about. And mostly it's like economic migrants is what's talked mostly about. So, and it goes with the whole rhetoric of migrants come and steal our jobs. So for Africans specifically, the reasons why they migrate is rooted in many complex issues, first starting with colonialism and its legacies. So during the era of colonialism, a lot of artificial borders were created, which boxed Africans into these territories and started creating laws which put policies to stop traveling. So prior to colonialism, Africans moved around the continent very freely without any like needs for visas, any restrictions, border restrictions or anything. So it was a free continent which allowed roaming, especially for Norman people. But after colonialism and the artificial borders, which put different ethnic groups together, started creating all these restrictions for Africans migrating. Domestic and regional conflicts goes together with the European proxy wars. So during the Cold War specifically, the continent of Africa was used extensively for proxy wars. And what happened was, with these borders created, different ethnic groups in there were given weapons by different sides who were fighting each other in Europe. So the US was supporting one area, while the Soviet Union was supporting other ethnic groups. So this tribal wars started arising, which were like all fueled by European powers, and they gave weapons which are still on the continent till today. And those conflicts continued on pushing migrants, pushing people out of their territories. And then the other reasons why Africans migrate is environmental issues due to like famines, droughts, and other natural disasters. This is mostly prevalent within the East African regions and also like around the Sahara. We'll talk a lot about that later because the case we're looking at is Senegal. So it's very important to understand the leading migration theories in order to really analyze migration, especially international migration. So to start, the institutional migration theory looks at government's policies and socioeconomic reasons why people migrate or why people can't migrate. So it looks at things such as what are the laws for refugees, what are the entry laws, what are the institutional benefits given to governments or given to migrants? What are the programs available to them to make assimilation easier? Do they have like free education, healthcare, all those kinds of things? Or like, are those things attracting them to migrate, or is it restricting them? And then the network theory argues that these migrant enclaves encourage more migration. So when there's a community of migrants in one area, other migrants find that attractive to come to because it's easier for them to settle in. They'll get access to more resources and a community. And then the push and pull model, which is what we'll focus on today, mainly focus on the underlying institutional, social, and environmental factors that encourage, that encourage migration. So it looks at what's the reasons. The push is what's the reasons in their home countries that push them out. So as we mentioned, like conflicts and famines and like lack of resources and stuff. And what's the other issues that pull them in the destination country? So what's attracting them in the destination? So again, if anyone has any questions or comments as we go on, feel free to just chip in. So for the push factors today, since we're focusing on Senegal, and to just give a brief background, Senegal is located in West Africa, in the western coast, right by the Atlantic. And it is bordered by the Gambia. That's where I'm from. And I also have family in Senegal. And Mauritania, which is very close to the Sahara. So that's why there's a lot of like environmental crisis there. So more than 2.5 million people in Senegal may be at risk of not having enough food for the year. And this is due to like the droughts happening, with another 700,000 in a state of crisis of emergency. So when you read the, I'm not sure how many of you read the article that I sent out, you would get more specific details as to the cause of like the environment, like it's drought. So they're not able to, a lot of their food resources come from agriculture. So that's not able to happen, and there's lack of rain and stuff. So it all contributes to, again, lack of food and resources, which means more people trying to find opportunities outside. So the article again by from Al Jazeera is called "The Energy to Stay: Senegal's Village of Women." So the specific area that this article focuses on, it's called Sintua Dam Dor, but some people call it the Futa Tora area. So that's what the locals call it. Or you would say Matam. The Matam area is very close to the border of Senegal and Mauritania, so by the Sahara. So far, due to like the environmental crisis, families have been, let us say, one in every, at least one person from every family has migrated, and most of them are men. This is not surprising because a lot of times when migration is occurring, families is the head of the household or the man who gets the first option to migrate out. And this leaves the woman remain home and become in charge of the family and the economy and just the keeping up the community while the men are gone. So the key role in managing resources are left to the woman. Yes, Karen.
Yeah, can I ask, when you say one person from every family, do you mean an extended family, or do you mean like an immediate family of mother, father, and children, or however, whatever type of parental combination and children?
So mainly every household. So like every house with like mother, father, children. So every immediate household.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the women become responsible of food production, animal husbandry, consumption choices, raising the children, just like, and a lot of times all the resources are very far from where they actually live. So women have to travel long distances to get water, to get woods for the fire and charcoal and stuff, which all like has its own impacts on their health and well-being as well. So the World Bank reported that 70% of that continent, referring to Africa's agricultural force, is produced by women. 80% of the food, 80% of food is contributed by women, and 90% of its sale is managed by a woman. And then in this specific area of the Futotora area, the women are in charge of like the gardens and everything there. And like I always like to do in every presentation I do is bring forth the stories of the specific people and put faces to them, because the numbers can be appealing, but it's important to know that these are people, you know, who are experiencing these things. So this is a woman, Sar, and she says, being the wife of a migrant is very difficult. Love is missing, physical affection is missing. And I thought this is very important because a lot of times when the men leave, the women are there for like 10, 15, 20 years and are still waiting on their husband with hopes that he would return soon. And just like a lot of time, some of them who never had children before left like that without families. And then the ones who had children before the husband migrated are just left in charge as single mothers, basically. But they're married, but they're left taking care of the children by themselves the whole entire period. So the woman becomes the head of household and basically doesn't have, since they're still married, don't have the right to get married again to someone else. This is something else that was really interesting. The woman stay, the man marries you, then immigrates and leaves you there. Says 35-year-old Jane Abanyang, who moved thousands of miles to Matam from Gabon to follow her husband, who in turn left for the United States 5 years ago. So again, just the same narrative of the men migrating and leaving the woman behind. So the migration routes that it's taking is important to look at. Like I said, the institutional theory explains the government policies that impact migration routes and whether migrants go or not. So a lot of Africans from the sub-Saharan African region, especially like Gambia, Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, have been recently traveling through something called the back way. So what they'll do is travel to North Africa, then try to reach Europe. So a lot of people from this specific community traveled through this same route. So around 480 people lost their lives in October. These are Senegalese people from a shipwreck that was heading towards Europe from the coast of Libya. And it's like not the only one. There's been numerous attempts by Africans who tried to reach Europe through North Africa. So 80% of transnational trafficked persons are women. usually trafficked into migrant labor, sex labor, domestic servitude, or extra. And this is important because, like the previous story, a lot of women are left home by their husbands for years. So when they finally decide to try and migrate to reconnect with their husband and families abroad, the policies are very restricting. So what ends up happening is they take on these local dangerous routes, which they become victims of smuggling or trafficking. And it's even worse for women, as we see 80% of transnational trafficked persons are women. A lot of sub-Saharan women also end up in the Gulf Coast, in the Gulf states, so like Lebanon and so on. So a lot of them there experience even more traumatic things, being domestic workers. So in the Middle East and North African areas. And for the men who travel through these routes, a lot of them, like I said, go towards Europe or towards African mining states. So like Angola, a lot of sub-Saharan African men travel there for economic reasons within the continent, and Mali as well. So the pull factors, as I explained, the reasons, the pull factors are the reasons that pull migrants into a specific destination. So in making this decision, they look at the employment opportunities. Are there jobs available? Do they have access to education? Would they have work permits upon arrival? The network that is available to them there. So if they're getting more information from people they already know who are there, they're more likely to travel to that specific area. The cost of travel, again, job availability, and like assimilation programs. So this is all through the institutional theory that explains this specific factors. So what programs are available to them in such countries. And before I get to the concluding remarks, I just wanted to ask if there's any questions on anything presented so far.
Hi, AjiFanta. I just have a quick question.
Yes.
So as you said that women are left alone and they have to take care of their family and stuff. So what is their status in society? Like, are they well respected? Because I know in a lot of like my country is Bangladesh. So I know that women aren't subjected to like the same level of importance as men.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to know what that would be in like Senegal and sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. And like, I just wanted to come back to this slide to point to these numbers. Like you said, women are left behind, and so they're in charge of like 70% of the continent's agricultural force. That requires a lot of respect, we would say, and produce 80% of food and manage 90% of its sale. However, this is not the case. You would think that the respect they would deserve for all this work. A lot of times women experience even harsher treatments from the husband's family after the husband has left. Specifically, if you go back to the article, this Jainaba's story, she explained how she's left and in charge of the husband's mom and uncles and brothers and everything. But those patriarchal practices and gender disparities still exist during these times. Even though the women become the main breadwinners, they still experience gender disparities in the society. So that doesn't change at all. Thank you so much for asking that question.
Do any other students have questions?
Hi. So when there was a slide you had about when the women try to migrate back to their families. So I'm not sure if maybe I missed this part, but do they try to migrate with their like kids and family members, or do they just migrate by themselves? And if they do migrate by themselves and something happens to them, what happens to the family that's left behind that they were taken care of?
Thank you so much for that question. You guys have really amazing questions, and a lot of them are still being explored. There's still more research that needs to be done on all of these things, but a lot of the women do try to migrate with their children. So to go back to this shipwreck, out of the 480 people, there were women on there, there were men, and there were children. There's a picture. I don't know if I could quickly pull it up here. Let me see. And if you just, let me search Senegal 480 people. Like there's a picture of a baby being pulled up from the water when this is happening. Can't find a specific picture right now, but I would send it to Karen if anything.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, it's such a powerful picture. Okay, I'll just email it to Karen. But yeah, like usually they do try to migrate with their children, which makes the route even more dangerous for them as women migrating with their families. And like the ones who are left home, the children have to be taken care of by extended family members, which just continues the whole cycle of like children who are left with lack of resources and who again try to take on the same migration routes. So to just make a couple of closing remarks.
I have another question. Sorry.
Yes, of course. I love the question.
Is there ever a case where the women might migrate instead of the men?
I'm not very sure on the data on that, but a lot of times the men are most likely, men migrate first before women. And even not just in West Africa, but even in like East African areas. So I know I did research on Somali migrants. And then when I realized was, even though the population of Somalis were within Somalia was like 50% women and 50% men, when you look at the number of Somalis that migrated to South Africa, it was 70% males and 30% men. So like that kind of shows the disparities between how men and women migrate. And also like there isn't sufficient data on women who migrate. A lot of times when you search up the data on migrants, you find a lot of stuff on male migrants, but not a lot on women who are migrating, especially as like economic migrants and stuff. The numbers mostly are focused on the men.
That's really helpful. I'll also share some comments after you're done presenting in response to that question. But I wonder, AjiFanta, if you could share a little bit, because you did mention a lot of environmental factors and climate factors that are driving migration. Would you have an opinion on if this policy response to migration is improving as there's greater understanding of climate change and climate processes as time goes on, or do you think that the situation is worsening?
I think there's definitely been more awareness and advocacy on it. A lot of people have started speaking out for the United Nations to recognize environmental refugees as refugees and give them asylum status to be able to enter other countries. But I I'm not really sure how much it has improved, since there's still so many environmental crises happening, not just in Africa, but like in Asia as well and other parts of the world, who become displaced people. So internally displaced persons, or people who have to be removed from their homes and move to other areas within the same border, but are just carted around in camps and stuff. So what happens with environmental migrants is they don't even have refugee camps. They don't have legal rights to refugee camps because they're not recognized as refugees.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So to just make more recommendations, I think more research needs to be done on the underlying factors that contribute to the disparities and the experience of men and women during migration. So like the questions that were asked here, to be able to fully answer them, more research needs to be done that is very gender inclusive, and pays attention to the disparities between women and male migrants and what happens when women are left behind. And then the multifaceted experience of migrants as well is not highlighted in international migration theories. So it's very important to have these interdisciplinary studies that look at, let's say, gender, environmental studies, economics, like different areas of migration, because it is a very complex phenomenon that touches on different areas of studies. And it would be, to get more comprehensive understanding of it, it requires interdisciplinary studies to be able to capture the full experience of migrants. This is something else I haven't really touched on very well in this presentation, but like xenophobic rhetoric against migration, again, is caused by misinformation or misconceptions of the migrant groups. Like I said, African migrants, I don't know if the number was 70 million or 740 million. I don't want to give you the wrong details, but that's the number of migrants who are internal migrants who are within the continent. So there's a large population. There's majority of Africans migrate within their continent before they even go to Europe. So it's important to understand that not all African migration is geared towards Europe. And the contribution of the migrants, even when they get to those countries, whether it's within Africa or European countries or in the Americas, is important to highlight their cultural, economic, and other contributions in the communities to be able to dismantle those misconceptions. That's all I have for you all today. I hope this was really helpful. This is very brief. I'll stop sharing my screen now. This is just a very brief introduction into like the concepts of migration, the theories that needs to be understood to fully grasp the study. But definitely, if you all have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you're doing any research on migration studies, I would love to get your perspectives as well.
Thank you so much. You're an amazing resource for these students, and that presentation was really, really excellent. I'll just give a few comments to wrap up. I think it is really, really helpful that you focused on gender disparities and really cleared up some misconceptions about migration that are really common. And I think, you know, something that stood out to me was showing the effect of migration on the family unit and the community as well, and even the whole region. So looking at sub-Saharan Africa and how, you know, there are effects that are not limited to just the person who's migrating. I think you noted that awareness and advocacy does not necessarily lead to policy change or comprehensiveness among policies. So that is important to mention. You know, in the United Nations community, civil society has a working group called the Committee on Migration, and they actually have subcommittees on xenophobia, on climate-induced displacement, and on women and children, which is a really great thing for the United Nations to have that sort of advocacy presence and expertise coming their way. But it doesn't mean that it translates into the ground. So that's something that's important as well, in recognizing there's like a political divide between education and actual grassroots effects of that education and knowledge. Now, some of what she talked about, the narratives of migration, also reflect other global trends. And it's not always the case. I think it was Malia who asked about, like, you know, is it ever, or actually maybe it was Aaliyah, but whether women are ever the ones migrating. And that sort of narrative actually is more present in like the Philippines and Southern Asia as opposed to Sub-Saharan Africa. So women migrating to do domestic work and then sending back remittances to their families. So that narrative is in existence some places in the world more dominantly than in Sub-Saharan Africa. Also, speaking about global displacement, there's over 70 million people displaced globally right now, which is more than 1% of humanity. And that statistic is actually from 2020 from the United Nations, I think from the UNHCR. So we know that this issue is growing and it's very, very significant. So getting a little background on this for our introductory politics course is very important. And I think just in closing, bringing it back to like, why is migration political? You know, so the definition I like to cite, which you guys would have heard in my lectures so far, is David Easton's that says, politics is the struggle for the authoritative allocation of resources. So based on AjiFanta's presentation, we see that the drivers of migration are often needs-based and in response to the environment around them, and not necessarily based on like a personal desire to migrate. It's not always a choice. It's sometimes, and very often, something that is driven from external circumstances. So we see people trying to achieve and obtain the resources that they need for survival and to thrive and have their family's livelihood increased. So that's why it relates back to politics. And there's obviously a global dynamic there and global disparities and inequality that also comes into play. So I hope that you guys enjoyed the lecture. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them now or to follow up in an email to myself or AjiFanta. And I think that was a really, really thorough presentation in terms of getting an introduction to these topics. So thank you so much, AjiFanta, for being here today.
Thank you for having me. And thank you again, all Albert, Maliha, and Aliyah for attending. I really appreciate your contributions, and it has definitely raised some important questions that require us to look into. And yeah, like Karen said, this is all introductory. And if we were to go more in depth, we would be here all day, because just the first part of looking at why Africans migrate and looking at the impacts and legacies of colonialism is its own topic of exploration on its own. So yeah, definitely a very interesting and complex topic.
Yeah, we would actually be here all month. So that's why, but you were very, very succinct. So thank you so much. And I'm going to end the meeting there. But yeah, thank you so much to everyone who attended live too. That was great to get to know you guys a little bit. Okay, so have a great day.